assume everybody's aware, but I signed the supplemental spending bill this morning, and so the only bill that remains unsigned is the tax bill. And Commissioner of Revenue can elaborate, but she and her department found an error in that in the language that would have a $102 million tax consequence for the state over the next 3 fiscal years. If you look at the spreadsheet that was part of your attachment, you'll see that with that on line 15, on line 11, with that $101 million consequence, with that, it brings our remaining balances down to unacceptably low levels at both the end of the this biennium and also the next one. So will not sign the tax bill until that has been corrected, as well as adding the high school league tax exemption back into status. Regarding the rest of it, I added funding for the supplemental bill, total of $80 million for this year and $160 million for the next biennium. There are areas of higher education, which were shortchanged by the legislature, as well as other critical needs. And the bonding bill, I added $182.8 million to the bonding bill, which in the language of the statute is $1,016 million, for a total of $1,198.8 million. The transportation part of the bonding bill is problematic because it identifies certain select projects which were chosen for reasons that are not disclosed, and those projects, some of them, and Commissioner Zelli could elaborate, some of them are not ready to begin anytime soon. Others are not eligible for state highway funding. For example, the Highway 12 project is a county road in Hanover County, so that's not eligible. And then furthermore, they use cash for some projects that are bondable, such as the Moorhead Railroad crossing, which means that they've used more cash from the general fund that would be necessary to achieve what they profess to intend. So we're going to urge the 4 caucus leaders to reconvene a process by which they will resolve those issues with the transportation part of the bonding bill. And I've asked the Lieutenant Governor to take charge of that, so I'll turn it over to her.
I'll just mention a bit about the transportation and what's in the bonding bill with that. There were some good things in the bonding bill with regard to transportation. As the governor mentioned, it was great that they included funding for the rail crossings in Prairie Island and Coon Rapids and Moorhead. But there are a lot of things. The bad news is that the bill makes a lot of promises around transportation that it can't keep. And it was disappointing overall that we didn't have a comprehensive solution to our transportation and transit needs. And so the governor has asked me to take one more stab at this to see if we can't find some sort of a solution. I will begin right away reaching out to both the House and the Senate to see if there is some space there to come up with a solution that I think Minnesotans are just so ready for. And I think the bonding bill is an example of how badly we need a comprehensive, well-rounded, and long-term and sustainable solution, because although we are able to fund some projects in this bill, it really demonstrates how much is left on the table that really needs to get done, most particularly projects all over the state and transit.
Respond to questions?
So, Governor, are you planning to veto the tax bill or pocket veto?
I have until next Monday to sign it, so I'll wait and see what the response is of the four caucus leaders. But I'm not going to sign the bill as it is now because of this $101 million error.
Well, the only way to change it would be in a special session. So are you going to see if they're willing to make the changes, or does this error need to be corrected?
I'm going to have the conversation with them if we can meet prior to next Monday, see what the alternatives they can posit.
Is the error the determining factor with the tax bill? Would you otherwise have signed it?
Yes, I otherwise signed. I would insist in a special session that the high school league provision be added, but I would not, I'd sign the tax bill as it is now, even absent that provision.
Including the reduction in the tobacco tax?
Yes, including that, I'd sign that.
Governor, you said
I don't agree with it, but I don't expect to agree with everything that's in the tax bill.
Governor, you said that the error would bring the state's revenue down to an unacceptable level, yet you're proposing tens of millions of dollars in additional spending. How is that not the same thing?
Well, if I factor in my spending and I add in the $101 million to correct this error, we'll see what happens with the transportation part of the bonding bill, but it's the remaining balance would then be $271 million at the end of fiscal 19, which is, I had said that I wanted $200 million setting aside money for transportation. Obviously, the way that they have approached transportation would eliminate the funds available for that in the next biennium, or a good part of them. So it's a little bit lower ending balance, but I think it's still responsible.
So as you seek to rebalance the list of transportation projects in the bonding bill, are you still, the $300 million figure, are you on board with that?
Well, I think it's high because, as I said, there are projects that they selected that could be funded through trunk highway bonds or through general obligation bonds, and I think a way to reduce the amount of cash that's required to achieve the kind of goals that they set forth should be reviewed.
You previously said that you didn't want a one-time transportation fix, but it sounds like you're at least open to it as part of this bonding transportation conversation?
Well, very reluctantly. I mean, it's a fig leaf over the failure to pass a comprehensive bill. And if the Lieutenant Governor and others can pull that off, more power to them. But absent that, and given the choices are either nothing at all or some one-time money to get at least some projects moving forward, then I'm reluctantly opting for the latter. If you want to elaborate.
I would just add that there's sort of a little bit of a fantasy in the one-time money in this bonding bill, because it suggests that we could make real progress on a whole bunch of very important transportation projects, especially in greater Minnesota. But in fact, the bill doesn't provide the dollars to do that, nor does it acknowledge that some of these projects are going to take years and years to get done. So we want to, whatever we do in this bill, we want to make sure that it's being, that we're able to deliver on what we're saying we're going to do.
Governor, what about the issue of transit? I know you mentioned you want transit funding, but I don't think you specifically said Southwest corridor. What are your feelings and stipulations on that?
There has to be a Metro Transit component to the bill, whatever bill, before I'll call a special session. I mean, the Republicans want to focus on just Southwest. It's broader than that. It should be broader than that. It should involve other projects, including ones in the East Metro. They're trying to use Southwest as a poster board for denying Metro Transit funding for all of the metropolitan area, and that's a very short-sighted strategy and one that is not acceptable.
But does Southwest Light Rail have to be part of whatever they do?
It should give the Metropolitan Council the ability through local government taxation to raise the revenues, or through some other procedure to raise revenues. So there would not necessarily need to be state money going into the Metro funding, Metro Transit funding, or in this case for a Southwest Light Rail project, but it could not prohibit the Metropolitan Council from using its funds available to achieve that purpose.
Does that include money from the Hennepin County Rail Authority, which was part of that middle of the night provision the Senate wanted to put in that the House didn't agree with? Would that satisfy where the money comes from?
Well, I believe that one allowed it was the county, wasn't it, to raise from 10% to 20%. The property tax level, which is a less desirable solution because the impact on Hennepin County. But again, I'm open to. There have been some various options posited, and I'm open to considering those. And Lieutenant Governor would take charge of those.
Are you sure that this was an error? And if so, how? Your commissioners call it an unintended drafting error. Are you sure that was the case? And how was this discovered and when?
Thank you. We do believe that it was an unintended error. As you all were aware, the tax bill language was being put together very late, and we do not believe that they intended to include potentially every seller of pull tabs in this, but they were aiming at the bingo halls. But we discovered it after the legislature had adjourned, and this is the understanding, and it's laid out in the letter.
Did your office discover this before? The tax bill had very little time, but it had more time than anything else. Was this just a language error that was not in the spreadsheets that you all were?
When was the bill presented to us, the tax bill?
We received the language of the tax bill was posted online after about 11:45 p.m. on Saturday evening, after the conference committee had adopted the report. The department spent all day Sunday attempting to review it and identify any questions or concerns. There were some items that we identified that made it into the reviser's corrections bill.
And what is the error, and how does it affect the stadium suites?
The error is a drafting area that expands the bingo hall pull tab rate provision, so it allows a 9% rate for any premises on which they conduct regular bingo. That could be expanded, instead of just at bingo halls, we read it to be anywhere where they would conduct regular bingo.
Am I relating it correctly to the U.S. Bank?
I will turn that over to Commissioner Franz.
I thought I'd never have another one of these. Well, it turns out, as you recall, in 2012, the legislation directed that certain revenues would be directed toward paying for the stadium-related costs, and the expansion of charitable gambling was one of those. We also added some corporate tax revenue in 2013. So what happens, the statute says when stadium revenues, designated revenues, fall below expenses, which will happen if this bill is signed into law, then we can authorize a blink-on tax for the suites, a 10% gross receipts tax on the suites at U.S. Bank Stadium, and also a lottery game has to be also implemented. So that's the reason is the revenues will fall below expenses.
Governor, could you run down your options? You've said you won't sign it as it now is. You could pocket veto it, you could veto it, or you could make an agreement with legislative leaders to have this in a technical corrections or revisers bill during the special session. Are those the three options you're looking at?
Those are the three, yes. But I, well, those are the three options.
And are you hopeful of?
I would like, as I said at the end of my letter, I'd like to meet with the four leaders as soon as they are available. We'll follow up with their staff to probably either later today or first thing tomorrow morning and see when we can find a time that all the four of them and Lieutenant Governor and myself can get together, and we'll see what their reaction is. I mean, this could be, if they're willing to accept my requirements in terms of the provisions to be added, this could, we need to give legislators some advance notice, but we could get this done in a very timely way.
Governor, just a moment ago you said that using Hennepin County debt capacity to fund Southwest Light Rail is a less desirable solution. Is it in fact, though, an acceptable solution to you?
Yes. Well, I would have to I'll defer to the Lieutenant Governor and to Chair Dunnick, but he's nodding his head. I understood it was not their preferred, but it at least allows them to raise the revenue.
Governor, I have not added up all of the cost of all the projects, all the things that you would like to see before you, I don't have the spreadsheet here. Is this, it seems as if you are relitigating every major project and issue, thank you, of the legislative session. Is it this, or you won't call a session?
Right.
So
these items.
That's the line in the sand.
The supplemental left out items that I have stated for weeks before the end of the session, I thought were imperative. The higher education, the funding for St. Peter, which was left out of the supplemental. So there's nothing in here that wasn't part of what I had discussed before. The bonding projects, again, were ones that I had advocated for, including telling the leaders that my highest priority was the health sciences building at the university, which was left out of the bonding bill. So these are my requirements. Put this additional funding, not for satisfy me, but for the needs of Minnesota. Higher education was shortchanged in a way that's indefensible, given the importance of the university and the Minnesota State College and University campuses all over the state. To shortchange them on both the supplemental budget bill and the bonding bill is really really just not in the best interest of Minnesota. So I'm going to insist on those. I'm going to insist on the funding we need to operate Anoka and St. Peter at acceptable levels, as well as the bonding request for St. Peter, so they can, over time, the next couple of years, make that facility a safer facility, a more therapeutic environment for patients and for staff. There are things in there that I think are imperative, and that's why I put them in there.
Governor, obviously there's a lot of provisions in the tax bill, some of which you said you liked. One with particular local interest in St. Paul here is the stadium provisions in the tax bill, which could end up being sunk by a Viking Stadium-related provision. What are your thoughts on the potential impact on the soccer stadium?
Well, I support the provisions that are in the tax bill. I don't think this doesn't need to be sunk unless somebody sinks it. I mean, the 4 caucus leaders are willing to take responsibility for their caucuses, and they agree to keep the tax bill, limited to what needs to be corrected, and also the high school league. Then we can either fix that by prior agreement, or they can pass a new bill with those 2 provisions altered in very short order. We could have this special session next week. We could have it as soon as they're willing to agree to these requirements, and we could get this all done. And for the sake of those affected by the tax bill, to give everybody the assurance that what they thought was in there is going to be signed into law.
Governor, if the lawmakers, if the speaker or the minority leader or one of them come back and say, I can agree to all the provisions except this one funding area or something like that, is that got it, or are you willing to negotiate?
I'm not going to get into hypotheticals at this point.
Commissioner?
But you said you need to have all of these things.
Right.
So is it a house of cards? They pull one out and the whole thing collapses?
Well, I'm going to stand on what I said. They need all to be in there, but we'll have to see what happens. I'm not going to get into. They need all to be in there. Okay, that's my position today. They all need to be in there. I expect them all to be in there. I require them all to be in there.
Commissioner, plans on the stadium issue, does this shortfall take hold in July or start to appear in July? And isn't it something that potentially could wait until next year if they wanted to?
The shortfall will begin July 1. So if the tax bill is signed with the error in it, those new rates are effective July 1 of 2016, and therefore the revenue will stop flowing into the stadium-related cost to support the stadium. So that's why we'd want to implement the suites tax immediately on July 1, 2016, also to try to make up for some of that revenue.
I don't know if you know this, but do you know how much the suites cost?
No, I do not personally.
What is the lottery game that you have to start?
It has to be a sports-themed lottery game that is required to be started on this next year, too.
But you're saying that the stadium reserve account is too low to handle a loss of this kind over the next how many months until they're back in regular session?
There is some revenue in the reserve fund, but within the next year it would be all eliminated, and there would be a deficit.
But you just said within the next year, they'll be back next year, so.
I don't have exactly what date it would run out, but it would be used up fairly quickly. As you know, the stadium costs are about $41 million a year right now, so it would be used up fairly quickly.
Governor, you spoke a lot about eliminating racial economic disparities this session. I see you have $35 million. Would that be spread mostly in North Minneapolis, or is that going to be spread through all communities of color?
Well, it was agreed upon by the conferees. It is more focused on Minneapolis, but it has projects for the greater metropolitan area, and it also has projects for greater Minnesota. I see this as a first step, and it provides for another $35 million in the next biennium. So it's a work in progress, and it's a start, but it's just a start.
Governor, is there any concern on your end if there's too many things involved, a special session, that it could get out of hand and go on for a really long time?
Well, that's why my final provision in the letter says that we have to agree in advance on the date of a special session, the maximum amount of time it could take, and then what the parameters. Now, as the caucus leaders have pointed out, they can't require their caucus members to follow that, but they should have enough assurance before they make these agreements that they can get their caucuses the necessary numbers in support of this. As you know, the bonding bill has to be passed with bipartisan support in both the House and Senate, so all 4 caucus leaders need to be on board before we can proceed.
Do you want it to be a one day, or have you set any?
One day is Plenty.
Okay.
Have you scheduled any meetings with the,
No, I've said in here your earliest convenience. They just received this letter about 11:33. So, we'll follow up either this afternoon or first thing tomorrow morning and see when we can meet. I'm available this weekend, next week. The sooner we can meet, the better. Find out if we have a basis for proceeding. And then we'll have to give legislators, I assume, a reasonable amount of advance notice since they have other plans that they've made as well. So we'll see how quick. I would like to put this together as quickly as possible, and we'll just see what that entails.
If this error was the result of the haste with which the legislature acts, what makes you think that a special session won't result in the same types of errors, given that at the last special session last year, some of the bills were only available for hours before they were voted upon?
Well, that's a good point. We should discuss that with the four caucus leaders and see what safeguards they can suggest and then implement so that we don't have a repeat of this. There certainly is evidence that, Commissioner Bowerly and her staff went through. I mean, this error, how many pages is that bill?
279.
I mean, this is one comma or one word?
It's effectively
One word. So even to identify and then to recognize the consequences of it, I think they deserve a great deal of credit for identifying it as they did and bringing it to the attention of the two tax chairs as she has. And again, it's a $101 million consequence over the next 3 years. So it's a very significant error. It affects the balance sheet for the entire state budget, and we'll have the opportunity to correct it.
Can I just say one thing? I just want to add to that the revisers and the revisor's office were dealing with hundreds and hundreds of pages of material in the last 24 hours on, I suspect, very, very little sleep. So I, for one, empathize with the lack of opportunity they had to proofread these bills and make sure that they didn't have mistakes like they're in there.
And my staff and commissioners and their staffs, like all of you, are working literally around the clock over the last week of the session and through the weekend, and a number of these bills we didn't get presented to me until, was it Tuesday, Joanna? So, and then we started to pour over them. The spread, for example, on the bonding bill, the spreadsheet doesn't agree with the language. So we had to go through that kind of analysis, and then, it's still not a reconciliation. We're using the language in the bill as the number here. I'm told there were members on the House floor told that there was a provision for Hermantown in the House bonding bill, which was not in the bill. So there was a great deal of confusion at the end there, and that mistakes happen.
Governor, what do you think is a reasonable amount of time to get this agreement together? And if at some point there isn't one, a month down the road or whatever, would you just say, well, we're not going to be able to do it?
Well, I don't think it needs to take months. I don't think it should take months. I think people want, for the bonding projects, the projects that are shovel-ready to be underway this construction season, the tax provisions and the consequences of those take effect in some cases on July 1st. There are projects dependent on the tax bill that are ready to go that you need to wait. I mean, I see this happening in the next couple of weeks.
You think, are you willing to hang with it longer or like
Well,
through the summer even if
it need
necessary?
be, but I mean, I've heard from all four caucus leaders, either directly or through the media, that they're all anxious to have a special session. So, I mean, I think where there's an interest in doing so, where there's a will, there's certainly a way to get it accomplished and do it in a very short order. I don't want to set a time frame now until I have a chance to talk to the four of them and see what their parameters are.
Governor, on a slightly different topic, your thoughts on the seeming closure of the Jamar Clark matter as it relates to the law enforcement and potential charges, and also has the state been invited to be part of this pilot project that the FBI and the U.S. Attorney announced today?
We got the materials at 11:40. I haven't had a chance to review the statements or the other statements made by the principal, so I don't have a comment on it. But to my knowledge, we've not been invited to participate in anything. My general counsel is shaking her head. We were not given. We were told yesterday that there was going to be an announcement today, but we were not given any advance notice.
but the fact that they've chosen not to file civil rights charges, should people accept that? There's been two
I'm not
separate.
going to comment because I haven't had a chance to read the statements made and those who disagree with that conclusion. So I'm just not, it's too important and too sensitive an issue for me to talk about when I haven't had a chance to review the facts.
On a different topic, out of Minneapolis, your response to the Minneapolis City Council passing the paid sick leave, and is that something you could see being a statewide model at some point?
Well, it was another controversial issue that didn't really get attention in the legislature, and it kind of developed late in the session. I mean, the business community wants, all those requirements to be consistent throughout the state, but then the question is, what are those requirements? So, Minneapolis at this point has the prerogative to exercise its own independent ordinance, and they did. I think people should be getting paid sick leave. I think it's in this really, and about. Well, I'm not sure the statistic, but the people who are denied paid sick leave now are disproportionately people of color, and they're low income, many hourly wages, and for them to be forced to work when they're sick, so many of them are in the hospitality industry, is not healthy for them. It's not healthy for the customers. So to me, it's just a common sense. Good employer policy to have. It takes effect July of 17, so there'll be a chance for it to be reviewed and vetted a bit more. But Minneapolis took a step, and I think that the people who benefit from that required sick leave deserve it.
Any concern about the burden on small businesses? I mean, companies with 6 or more employees, that gets down to be pretty small businesses.
I believe there's an exemption or a different requirement for people under 20. I don't know the details of that. I mean, that needs to be taken into account. But those people who work for small businesses still get sick and need and deserve to have some kind of responsible policy.
Governor, you said a couple of weeks ago that if there wasn't a transportation agreement, you wanted some money left on the bottom line to carry over into next session. Where does that stand, and does that change at all given your special session scenario here?
Well, I'm glad the Lieutenant Governor and is going to work with Commissioner Zelli and Chair Dunnick and with the legislative conference leaders, Senator Dibble, Representative Kelly, to see what's possible with a comprehensive package. Absent that, we'll have to see what can be devised in terms of something. I said the one that's in the bonding bill now, I think is bad policy and sets a bad precedent in terms of the certain legislators who have whatever positions of influence they have to be able to hand-pick certain projects and leave a vast number of other projects all around the state out of that equation is really a bad precedent. And as others have said, whatever the reasons are chosen, they weren't chosen for their readiness to go. They're not even chosen for their eligibility for the kind of funding that was provided. So I mean that section needs to be reworked. So I'm willing to give it a chance to see how it turns out before I comment further on it.
Any specific, were there any of those specific transportation projects you're referring to that were far from ready that you think may have been handpicked?
Which ones, Charlie? Correct me if I'm wrong now on Highway. Go ahead, please. Highway 12. What the eligibility there?
Well, Highway 12, the governor described as a good example of one that is a state highway. It's largely safety improvements. We totally agree they're needed. A lot of the work is done by Hennepin County on a particular interchange, so the trunk highway funds really wouldn't be eligible. It's very complicated, requires much more planning. We are actually starting work on Highway 12 with median and a left turn lane, so you don't need legislation. We actually are starting that work. So I think what the governor's described as a number of projects that have been cited either don't really fund the entire project, like Highway 14, only a little bit of it, and in ways that ultimately nothing really gets done because of the time lag and getting local partners and planning in place.
But I'll just say for myself, I understand the concerns on Highway 14. I've heard some citizens out in that area too of the serious hazard that exists, and I'm glad that you're working on it already, and I'm willing to take the lead with you to work with Hennepin County and get that project underway and completed as soon as possible.
Governor?
On the disparities, you know, Minnesota has some of the worst achievement gaps in the country for Latinos and blacks. I see you have some bullet points here. Is there any thought given to school choice, some other options for parents that might want to send their kids to good schools, better schools?
Well, this, in the context of the special session, I mean, those are issues that have been debated a number of years in the legislature, and there was a tuition tax credit proposed in this session, which I said I would not accept, so I'm responsible for that not being part of the final package. I mean, we'll have a chance back in 2017 to look at the whole scope of education initiatives, but that's the time for that, not in the special session.
Governor, Speaker Dowd has just sent you a letter that says that the drafting error can be remedied with or without legislative action. And he says, secondly, we agree to permanently reinstate the Minnesota High School League's tax exemption. And if those are your two big concerns, that can be taken care of.
Well,
is that at least a step forward?
It's new information. I'm glad to take his response. And Olin and I need to rely on the Commissioner of Revenue, and she needs to rely on her General Counsel to make the determination. We can't allow for ambiguity in the tax bill, especially when there are going to be a lot of gaming facilities who, if they see this this window of opportunity, are going to take advantage of it. And once, if the door's been open, and take us to court over the language. You know, I'm not a lawyer, but I know we're a strict constructionist state, and that means the language of the law is the language of the law. It doesn't matter what the legislative intent was if the language is clear. So again, I'm not qualified to make that determination, but if the Commissioner of Revenue and her legal staff say that this needs to be changed, then I'll stand on that determination.
Is it at least a step forward, though, that they're willing to agree to those two things?
Absolutely.
And maybe that can be the basis for further agreement on these other issues?
I'm just taking what you said to me for verbatim. But so far, sounds good. Now he needs.
I'll write back and let him know you said
Tell him now if he just would agree on everything else, we're all set. Good work, Tom.
Anything else?
All right. Thank you.